And maybe we can move straight to the opening remarks by the President of the Malaysian Gas Association. Encik Azli, are you there?
Assalamualaikum and good morning. I think first of all, I would like to thank the Asia School of Business for working together with MGA to deliver this topic, which is very important, which is very relevant for this time. And right now, for example, in general, in Malaysia, we have a complete perfect storm. I would say we have the OPEC plus issue, which resulted in the lowest oil price in I think the last 20 years. COVID-19, and in a way, a little bit is a bit of political instability, or now maybe a bit more stabilized. So I think let me just introduce MGA very quickly in case some of you do not know MGA. MGA is the voice of the oil and gas industry, or the gas industry in Malaysia. We represent full across the value chain, basically from upstream to downstream, even from some of the banking that supports the gas industry. Our mission objective is mainly to deliver value with sharing of information with all the members. So the challenges that we have, I think, which Dr. Renato will talk about, the OPEC plus COVID-19 and the energy transition, which is something that hopefully will bring a lot of values to the members. And many of us, including myself, I think, is thinking what will happen to the industry after, I would say, COVID-19. Even when will this OPEC plus I guess, thing will end. So what will happen to the oil and gas price? The reason we also think about the oil price, because most of the LNG contract are linked to the oil price.
Renato, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you, Saif. Thank you, Hazli. It has been a great pleasure to be in this virtual contact with many of you. It's a great pleasure to share a bit of our research and our perspective on these recent changes. To start, let me just say what seems to be obvious nowadays is that we are living an unprecedented situation, and there has been strong demand to make sense of it all. So I've been giving interviews to publications, participating calls. I recently wrote a post about that. That is at the ASB website. You can check www.asb.edu.my, and also in webinars like this. So there is a strong demand to understand what's going on, and the reason is we are living a shock of demand with the COVID-19, and also a shock of supply with the OPEC plus breakdown of negotiations. And all of that have significant implications to the economy in terms of investment levels, jobs, and fiscal resources. So my objective today is to talk about what are the immediate, short-term, and long-term threats to the oil and gas industry, and perhaps making sense of it, trying to understand the different variables, we can be better prepared. So in the immediate, I would put the COVID-19 demand reduction. In the short term, the OPEC plus breakdown of negotiations, but in the long term is the energy transition. And as I will perhaps make it clearer, this long term is now affecting this short term. The perspective of an energy transition is now affecting how OPEC is going to deal with their production and the rate of extraction. So in this webinar, I will address the immediate effects of the COVID-19 on energy demand with recent numbers. I will contextualize the recent OPEC plus negotiation breakdown in light of a dispute over market share and energy transition issues. I will also estimate the potential impacts of a low oil price on new investments and production volumes. And I will try to provide some reasonable speculations about the long-term legacy of the COVID-19 crisis that may affect oil demand. So to preview some numbers, a price reduction from $60 as we had at the beginning of the year to $30 from 2020 to 2030, I crunched the numbers, and that will lead to a reduction of the average CAPEX by 170 billion per year from crude production. It will also reduce the government take, all the different ways that the governments, they raise money from the oil industry, such as royalties, production sharing, and so on, by 616 billion on average per year from 2020 to 2030, if we have a $30 a barrel. And likely we'll see an increase of the share that comes from low-cost sources, such as OPEC. So OPEC countries are likely to regain market share and also fight to reduce the rate of energy transition. So what do you think is going to be the GDP growth for 2020? Is it going to be 2% or higher? 1 to 2%? Is it going to be more or less in a stagnation that it's around zero? It's going to be a -1 to -2 or -2 to even lower. Looking at the predictions from international agencies. So the World Bank started the year on January 8th, thinking that the economy would grow by 2.5%. It was kind of a low, but God, we would love that growth nowadays. So that was low, but it's still not so bad. And especially now it looked like amazingly good. The OECD, in an inter-economic assessment published just at the beginning of the month on March 2, they project a drop from around 3%, that was their original prediction, to 2.4%. And the reason was the breakdown of supply chains and the economic activity in China. But they also said something really important. If coronavirus end up spreading to Asia Pacific region, Europe and North America, they thought that, well, economy would end up slowing a lot. And they predicted a drop of 1.5% in 2020, half of the rate projected prior to the virus outbreak. When we look at the oil specific predictions, we started the year with a slow growth or almost flat. So when we look at the International Energy Agency oil market report, which is a flagship report, every month they publish it with numbers from the industry. The last one from March 9, they actually reduced for the first time that they predicted a decline. First time since the world financial crisis in 2008. So they now predicted a decrease of 90,000 barrels a day in comparison to 2009 to 99.9 million barrels a day on average. That is, let's say that it's flat. There wouldn't be much change in the total demand. And again, this is from March 9, so it's less than 21 days. The Energy Information Agency, and that's from the US government, they also publish a short-term energy outlook where they actually, on March 11, they were predicting a growth of the total oil consumption in this year, in 2020, to a growth of 0.4 million. That was also a decrease from before, but it was still a positive number. When we go to the latest types of forecasts, so Restart Energy, they are doing a great job on modeling the impact of the COVID into demand for oil. And the reason is really simple. That's the main unknown right now in the world. They now predict that the global GDP is going to contract by 1%. So it's kind of in line with what you predicted here in this webinar. And that would reduce the total demand for oil by 2 billion barrels this year in about 5% contraction. So we are going from a small growth to 5% contraction, and that's the prediction in March 24. But what if the economy actually slows down even more? So that's what McKinsey, for example, on March 25, in this briefing note about the COVID-19, they think it might well be possible in two different scenarios. One predicts the economy to slow down by 1.5%, another by 4.7%. So if the economy goes down by 4.7%, then the total demand for oil is going to go even more. It's going to slow down even more. In one important thing about the COVID and the energy industry is that before I get there, two important things here. One is that when facts change very rapidly, forecasts do not have a long shelf life. So that's one of the issues that we have to absorb new information almost every day to understand what's going on, because everything's changing so fast. The rate of growth of the disease is extremely fast, and countries react by imposing lockdowns or travel restrictions or restrictions on agglomeration, and all of that, they have impact on the amount of oil that can be consumed. The second thing is that pessimism is on the rise. If we look any kind of work and predictions from the beginning of the year to early March to late March, every day it's actually becoming more and more pessimistic about the direction of the world economy. And for the energy sector, in particular for oil and gas, this is particularly complicated because the main message of this pandemic, they stay at home, is particularly bad for the oil sector. So if you have the transportation hub of the country coming to a standstill, that is an issue, and that has happened throughout the world. The issue is that about 29% of all the energy that we consume in the world goes for transport. So almost 30% of every energy that we consume is to be used for transport. And transport is in its vast majority driven by oil. Liquid fuels, essentially oil. There's a very little of natural gas used directly in transportation and some biofuels. And very little yet electricity, although this is changing fast. Liquid fuels, in oil in particular, they are about 96% of the supply for the energy of transport. In total, 57% of the oil demand in the world goes for transportation. So imagine you have a sector that absorbs 57% of the demand for oil, and then you have policies saying that stay at home, don't go out, don't fly, don't go to the office, stay at home. So this is a major challenge to the oil and gas industry, in oil in particular. So someone asked, what is the pie chart on the left? Let me return to that. The pie chart here is the world energy balance. How much of the final energy consumption goes to different sectors? So transport is 29%. To the right, you have the EIA prediction of what is the source of energy for transportation from 2010 to 2040. So these are the data that backs the importance of transport as a source of demand for the oil and gas industry. What we have seen is that airlines around the globe, they are parking planes with 70% cancellation rates for international flights. And here I have to credit my source as the Instagram of Tony Fernandez with an image of Kelauea-2. As you can see that, yeah. Yes, it's Kelauea-2 with planes stopped, cannot fly, and due to prohibitions, due to lack of demand. It's more than an issue just for the month of March. We have seen that it's extended into April, and much more likely the summer peak of travel in the US and Europe is unlikely to occur this year. And the prediction is that global consumption of jet fuel will fall by 3 million barrels per day. By late March, we had over 40 countries imposing some kind of a lockdowns as you and I are in this restricted movement order, movement control order. And another 135 adopted rules against mass gatherings. And that also affects conferences, concerts, and so on. We have evidence from traffic data that in urban areas, there is a similar pattern of stay-at-home phenomenon. So in this era of big data, we can easily track people's mobility, and that has shown that people are definitely staying at home. That is leading to a halt into oil and gas consumption, oil consumption in particular, liquid fuels. So by itself, only the things that I'm telling you now, the COVID-19 would lead to a sharp demand decline for oil. In normal times, we would expect OPEC to be called to regulate supply, promote further cuts, balance the market. But instead, what we have seen is that Saudi Arabia announced on March 8th that it would discount its crude and pump more oil. In what appears to be this self-inflicted wound, the OPEC basket went from a peak of $70 in January to a low of 24 in March, right? In the OPEC basket, you can check on OPEC's website, including for a long data here, that right now it's composed of this reference basket of these markets. So some specific blends, like the WTI is about $21. Canadian blends are selling at $12. So this has been a major impact into the oil sector. In this year, OPEC is celebrating its 60th anniversary. So it was launched in Baghdad in '96. Let me make sure. Yeah. It was created to coordinate production between large oil exporters and increase the revenue. So OPEC played an important role in bridging an information gap between sovereign states and oil majors that later led to nationalizations, led to price increases in the oil shocks of 74, 79, and so on. But this organization had always to walk a fine line between restricting output too much, which encouraged oil-to-oil competition from high-cost areas, and substitutes like renewables, or producing too fast, extracting too fast, which would accelerate reserve depletion and maybe not monetize their reserves to the extent that they would like. So that has been like the two things that OPEC members, they had to take into account. If I restrict too much output, then I will encourage production outside OPEC countries, but also I will encourage at the limit back in the 70s and in 80s, that would encourage, for example, the synthetic oil and coal to liquids technologies, for example. Or if I just produce as much as I can, then I might be depleting my reserves. And if the world believes that oil will always be needed, we will end up poorer sooner than otherwise would be the case. So they try to walk this fine line. Also, like any cartel, they have a problem of coordination. Who is going to bear the cost of production cuts? It's in everyone's benefit for everyone to obey a production cut and to bring price up. But anyone that can free ride from that and can continue to produce, to extract at a high rate while others are cutting back their production will be better off. So this is a typical problem of cartel in cartel economics, and they always had this issue. Traditionally, Saudi Arabia has played this role of being the swing producer. But sometimes, even in Saudi Arabia, they get tired of that. So let me explore the first problem. High oil price encouraged competition. In the late 70s, high oil price encouraged production from frontier areas like offshore North Sea and Mexico. That led to overproduction and a price collapse in the 80s. If I go even earlier, in the 70s, the early 70s, we had the start of production, drive of production to outside OPEC areas. Petronas is from 74. And there was the beginning of majors trying to get offshore oil from non-OPEC regions. In the late 70s, the high price of oil encouraged oil companies to go to North Sea, UK and Norway, but also Mexico to develop at fast speed their Cantarell field. So back in the early 80s, production started to boom, and then what OPEC did was to have to cut even more of their share. They end up with around 25% of the total share, from 60 to 25, up to the point that Saudi Arabia said, no more, you guys are not keeping your words, I will pump more oil. So Saudi Arabia went from about 3 million barrels per day in 1985 to 11 million barrels per day later. In the mid-2010s, high oil price helped the shale revolution and the E&P in ultra-deep waters like pre-salt in Brazil. I'm from Brazil. I was in Brazil before going to the US to do my master's in PhD, and I did research on the oil industry in Brazil. And one of the things that it really helped was it was the opening of the oil market when Brazil allowed Petrobras to partner with international oil companies, but also the idea of continuously increasing oil price. That created a momentum to invest in high-risk frontier areas, technologically sophisticated, but also with a high geological risk at the time and complex E&P engineering projects. What we had was a price collapse in 2014 following a decision by Saudi Arabia to regain market share from shale. So that was a clear decision of Saudi Arabia saying that if the more we cut, the more we give market to US producers, and we are going to try to kill them. Please note that OPEC countries, they have the lowest cost of production. Even at $60, they risk losing market share to non-OPEC producers. Back in the mid-2000s, it was around $100. And they thought, well, if we reduce to 60, 50, they will be driven out of the market. That's not what we have seen. It has clearly been the case that the more OPEC has cut, the more they have given market share to US, Brazil, Norway, and so on. And the cuts have affected most of the time Saudi Arabia as a swing producer. So here we have the production costs for different countries, and here's some numbers. So we have that United States on average has about $38, very close to Brazil. Malaysia about 21, so it's within more of the more expensive ones. But the vast majority of Middle Eastern countries, they have a very low cost of production. So they can add output without having to invest a lot, or they can sustain a low cost environment for much longer. It's true that their national budget might not, but operationally speaking, they can still be profitable at a low oil price. But if we see here, one critical thing is that the average price of barrel here is it's below 45. So there is opportunity for the industry to continue to thrive below $60. At $20, a lot of supply can be kicked out of the market. And of course, in any country, you have the marginal cost fields. Fields that are at current technology, they are too expensive to be developed. So the average cost for US, for example, doesn't take into account that some stripper wells will always have a very high cost of production, and about 1.5 billion barrels of oil per day actually comes from stripper wells in the US, wells that they have an output of less than 10 barrels per day. So the point here is that OPEC countries, in particular Middle East countries, they have a very low cost of production. They can withstand this low oil price, but not necessarily the high cost one. But the OPEC countries, they are now facing a paradigm shift, which is the risk of substitute. So remember that if I keep price too high, I invite competition, oil to oil competition. Another thing is inviting substitutes. In the 80s, that was not much of the case because technology wasn't there. But if you do have substitutes now, credible substitutes, then the calculation may shift from too fast extraction, that was the main concern of OPEC from the 60s to the 2000s, from now to too slow production. So what we know is that the cost of renewables have decreased sharply in the last decade, and now are the most competitive option on a LCOE, a levelized cost of electricity base for electricity generation in many markets. So we have the several large-scale solar auctions delivering electricity at 3 cents of dollar per kilowatt hour. So that's extremely competitive. The main issue, although at an LCOE basis they are competitive, you still have the issue of intermittency. However, as battery costs decrease and electric vehicles gain market share, now oil gas, they have a credible substitute, including transportation. So if we remember that transportation is 96% liquid fuels, and if you have like a credible substitute for transportation, that is a red flag here. It really is something that you have to stop and thinking about what is it going to be in the next 20, 30, 40 years in this industry. And that can lead to a shift of paradigm, which is rather than thinking that you were producing too fast or you had the risk of producing too fast, the risk is now that OPEC countries may be producing too slow and risk having stranded assets, that their huge reserves is basically losing present value every time that renewables become more competitive and EVs gain market share. Because what is essentially an electric vehicle is a big battery on wheels. So with Internet of the Things, with net metering and so on, you might have self-production of electricity and getting charged to EVs with costs that can at some points even be marginally close to zero, and that can drive a lot of demand and reducing the demand for liquid fuels. If you increase the amount of EVs on the market, which is already 5 million cars out there. In a BNP Paribas study, one that we discuss in the classroom, I teach a course on energy markets and policies and sustainability. In one of these studies called Wells, Wires, and Wheels, the authors, they calculate that the long-term break-even for gasoline is between $11 and $12, and for diesel, 17 to 19 when compared to EVs. Why so low? It's because electric vehicles are much more efficient in converting electricity, converting energy into mobility. Also, the maintenance cost of electric vehicles is way lower than ICEs, internal combustion engines, because you just don't have the same amount of moving parts. So it's 30 moving parts compared to about 3,000. So maintenance costs are lower. You can also drive for much longer using for the same amount of energy with EV versus ICE versus gasoline. In fact, in one of the classroom exercises I do at ASB is to compare the efficiency of a Perodua MyV versus a Tesla S30, and how much the cost and what are the parameters that makes one more cheaper than the other and so on. So what we have here is a question for the OPEC countries. Is it time to accelerate the rate of extraction to, on purpose, reduce prices? Perhaps reduce the attractiveness of the renewable options right now, delay that transition, but also make sure that you drive out of the market those high costs, those high cost producers. So you regain control of the market and you become the key players of this industry. Again, right now OPEC has about 44% of market share. So that is a big question. In that question, it's actually one of the scenarios of a recent, published in January, study by International Energy Agency called the Oil and Gas Industry in Energy Transition. So they analyze, okay, so what might happen with the oil and gas industry, and how can the oil and gas industry sustain a scenario of transition to the Paris Accord type of agreements to limit in no more than 2 degrees the amount of climate change. One of the scenarios which they assign low probability is that the oil and gas rich countries, the resource holders, they will on purpose drive the price to around $25, to below 25 a barrel, and then remain within this tight band between 25 and 35, right? Why they assigned a low probability? Not because it didn't make sense, but rather because the budget of OPEC countries, they are very dependent on higher oil prices. But with time, they can actually pump more oil. They can invest. They have access to reserves, and they have a very low cost of production. So if you want to drive out other producers, you might need to increase your volume. And that is one of the potential things here. A very risky thing about this scenario is that you might end up having fluctuations here. You might end up having higher volatility. You drive prices down to affect everyone that is a non-OPEC producer, and then you drive price up again. And this volatility makes the planning of investments in oil and gas outside OPEC very risky, because you don't know what the price will be. At any moment, OPEC can pump more, and the price can suddenly go down, affecting the return on investment of different projects. So this is one risk, but one risk that I think it's important to be mindful about it. So let me go to the consequences, doing a field-by-field analysis to tell us how much of the production within the world do not break even at $30, resulting in lower CAPEX and lower fiscal revenues. So this is from a database that I subscribe on field by field from Rystad. And here is the forecasted crude oil production under different scenarios. So at $30, we have a drastic fall on the total amount of oil output from 2020 to 2030. At 40, the gap is not so high, but at around 60, we basically have growth and then a stability. And that is analysis from fields, identified fields. So which fields you would put in production if $60 were your predicted price of a barrel. When we look at CAPEX, we see that the CAPEX for $30 and $40 also shows a drastic decrease, while CAPEX for 60 would require much more investment because then you have to develop this higher cost resource. In the fiscal revenues, this is going to be a major impact of a low oil prices. At $30, fiscal revenues, they go to about 260 billion per year. At 60, we are talking almost $1 trillion per year. So this is a huge change. You see that it's non-linear, in part because the contracts, they tax more the upside. So whenever the price of oil tends to be higher, a lot of the different contracts, they appropriate more of the rent rather than the operator or the consortium or the different players. So to summarize this data, what we have is that the CAPEX loss for crude oil in the world for all non-fields, if we go from $60 to $40, that is 136 billion less of investment on average per year. If we go for 60 to 30, 170 billion. OPEX, the impact is much lower. You just have operational expenses, but it still represents a fall of up to 74 billion. The biggest impact is on government take. So the fiscal revenue of oil-rich countries will suffer a lot in this scenario, up to 660 billion in terms of government take for a price of oil if it stays in $30 up to 2030. So that's the average. In the volume loss, it's about 28 million barrels per day. That volume, you would expect that it would be fulfilled mostly by OPEC countries. Let me bring here Malaysia-specific numbers. So doing that same analysis, but restricting only to Malaysia, not even to the joint development area between Malaysia and Thailand, but only Malaysia, what we have is a CAPEX loss of 1.7 billion per year between today and 2030. An OPEC loss of 404 million in this scenario of 60 to 30, and a government take loss of $7.3 billion. In terms of volume, it's not a lot. It goes to 0.3 million barrels of oil equivalent. So here I'm counting both gas and oil, and as you all know much more than Malaysia is essentially a gas-rich. 2/3 of its production comes from gas. So the volume lost due to lack of investment in these higher cost areas would be 0.341 million. Is this the new normal? Is this something that we need to prepare? So if you believe that what happened in OPEC was not just a fight between Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, that they didn't like each other and they decided to threat each other, and it came out of that, but rather something strategic to drive out, again, high-cost producers, but now also with a vision that there is a limit to how long they can stay with the reserves, because we might have a energy transition. Then that can be the new normal. If you believe that it's a strategic decision, then we might have to get used to price around $30. And that is the take that the Petrobras is taking. So just last week, the president of Petrobras, the CEO of Petrobras, said, we are preparing the company to live with oil below $25 and not anymore of $40. We are not expecting a substantive price recovery. And why is that? Because Petrobras is a big deep offshore and ultra deep offshore producer. Petrobras is within among the highest cost of production in the world, and they had to stress test their production according to different price levels. And what they did already was to cut about 100,000 barrels per day of production. They deferred promotions, bonus, hiring, and payment of dividends. It is a strategic view that we better get ready now, because there might be more strategy behind what OPEC's doing rather than the bad timing of the COVID and also just the will of a prince. But rather, it might be related to long-term trends related to the ability to monetize your your reserves. So let me move here. We are getting to close to the end of that. Let me move here to speculation. So this is not based on data, it's based on more of an observation and reasonable speculation. We might have two important long-term legacy of the COVID-19 on energy markets. One is the idea that work from home is a new normal. I don't mean that we are all going to keep working from home. What I mean is that once firms in all sectors of the economy, they devise policies, they move systems for this business continuity, and they have ways of having their people working from home, it just is much more likely. All of those investments in systems and in time might not go simply to be wasted. And if people start to a higher degree working from home and holding more webinars like this, it means that you are not using so much transportation. It means that you might be using more electricity, which is good for gas. That's the main source of use of natural gas. But you might not be using so much liquid fuels, and that is a direct hit into crude oil. The second thing that I think it's really worrisome is the idea of a breakup of global supply chains. So countries are increasingly adopting trade restrictions in name of national security. So you cannot export ventilators, you cannot export gloves, you cannot export face masks, and so on. This protectionism and populism, also we have seen that, now it's within a context of a health pandemics and can lead to lower trade across countries, meaning lower demand for transportation of goods. So if one of the characteristics of our contemporary economy has been the integration, the global value chains, the fragmentation of trade across countries. If we have a drive, including through political lobbying of industry saying that you have to sustain me, we have to buy from your own country, because if another situation like that arises, we cannot rely on imports to supply the needs of our population, you might see a situation where you have a more inefficiency in the economy and also more of local supply chains rather than global supply chains, reducing the total amount of demand for transportation in that. So as a conclusion, the full impact of the COVID-19 is still hard to assess, but latest estimates point to a 5% demand reduction for 2020 in terms of the oil industry. The demand shock coincided with a supply shock, but that was triggered by existing problems within OPEC that we can trace back some of the issues to the birth of OPEC. Saudi Arabia may now want to monetize its large reserves before they get stranded. And by the way, one of the things that we do in the classroom at ASD, I had all the students, the MBA students, having to read the prospectus of Saudi Aramco and identify all the risks that the company disclosed. And it's pretty clear that a lot of the risks are related to the political control of OPEC on the operations of how much they can produce, how much they will invest in spare capacity, and so on. Happy to talk more about that into Q&A. For the E&P sector, be prepared for a capex reduction of the order of 170 billion per year, which in Malaysia, that would be around 1.7 billion per year if the price goes and stays at $30. Another is that long-lasting legacy of COVID-19 may affect the transportation sector. And the idea of work from home as something that is much more common and widespread, and also the breakup of global production chains, global value chains. So these are my thoughts. I welcome your views about it and any questions you might have. I think we are all learning. These pandemics made us to be interested in epidemiology and graphs and figures, in how supply chain for ventilators, for masks, and so on. And I think every sector is experiencing these shocks in a different way. So they are all experiencing it, but there are different bottlenecks, different impacts to that. So so now we'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions from you all. Thank you very much.